I spoke to David Loyn, who's the author of The Long War, the inside story of America and Afghanistan since 9/11. I started asking him about what this new government meant for the country.
All of the people who were saying the Taliban are more moderate or they've been wanting to reach out and build an inclusive government have been proved wrong. I have to say I wasn't one of them. I've been saying the Taliban is one Taliban. They are as they are, and they've shown that by appointing Mullah Hasan Akhund, who's filled the same figure in the late 90s, the same sort of position, and he was pretty anonymous then as the de facto head of the administration in the late 90s when they were in government. Mullah Baradar is a very interesting figure. His deputy, he is seen as somebody who wants to talk to the West. But clearly the foot soldiers, the people who fought the war, have come out absolutely on top in any internal discussions on appointments. And you have now an entire cabinet of nearly all Pashtuns, nearly all people from the south, all men. The Ministry of Women's Affairs has been closed down in Afghanistan. And there are 3 members of the government who have American prices on their head, including Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's the Minister of Interior in a very senior position in the government. And he's a man who has been responsible in recent years for plotting and carrying out large bomb attacks on Kabul. He's now responsible for the security of the same city.
So the Taliban have shown their cards to the international community that they've been trying to court for some time now. How does the world respond to this? Do they stop, wait, and keep on watching?
I think it's a very interesting reaction that we're going to see in coming days. Western countries have been saying that they will be united on this, that they will take a stand all together. You won't have some Western countries recognizing the administration and others acting in a different way. So they're trying to act in concert. And I think many other countries around the world will be following that lead potentially. China, I think, will recognize this administration in good time, as and when it's properly formed. They're still saying it's an interim administration. Remarkably, for those of us who've been watching this very closely, it's taken them a long time to form this government. It's 3 weeks now. So we've all been waiting to see who they are, and it turns out that they're just the same people as they were before. What the West is saying is we need to see deeds and not words. So it doesn't matter in a sense who the individuals are, it's what they do. And what you're seeing on the screen now is the response of the people of Afghanistan. And I think the biggest challenge of the Taliban is that this is not the country they ruled when they left 20 years ago. The Western intervention did have a significant impact on a whole new generation born since the Taliban were last in power. And there have been big civil disobedience protests, actually getting bigger by the day this week, at the same time as the one bit of armed resistance in the Panjshir Valley north of Kabul does appear for the moment to have been squashed.
Women tried to protest. The Taliban army came in, squashed it, firing in the air. I suppose they're asserting their authority and that there's very little tolerance that will be given to any kind of dissent.
But it's going to be very difficult to manage, a country that they don't have any consent in. Mm-hmm. Are they going to just crack down all the time? And you say they were firing in the air. It seems that there were some people killed in the western city of Herat in one of the protests today, certainly firing into the crowds there. So I think, the Taliban are feeling their way in this new situation. Afghanistan is a very unfamiliar country to these people. I mean, the Doha leadership have been in Doha for some 10 years. 4 of the 5 senior Taliban people released from Guantanamo Bay in 2014 in a prisoner swap. They're part of the new government. Part of the prisoner swap conditions was that they wouldn't be allowed to leave Doha. So they've been in a Gulf state. They've not been in Afghanistan. This is quite an unfamiliar society to them, and I think it's going to be very difficult for them to manage it in anything like the same way as they did in the 1990s. And of course, if they do come out on the streets and start beating people and whipping people and insisting that they pray 5 times a day and so on, then I think it's going to be very difficult for the West to support them. But the international community have huge challenges because the Taliban won't be able to manage this sophisticated country. There's no food, there's no money in the banks, the banking system has effectively collapsed. And when I say there's no food, we're talking about 20 million people who are facing hunger, starvation as the winter approaches. So Afghanistan is the only country in Asia where there are levels of poverty similar, frankly, to some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's going to be very difficult for the Taliban to manage this, given the unrest that we're seeing.
So the Taliban then hugely dependent on foreign aid is in the short term. And that's going to be a difficult one for them to appear to be strong and independent, but at the same time, having to have their hands open as well.
It's going to be very difficult for donor countries as well. And of course, the World Food Programme and other big agencies, the UN programs are appealing for aid, appealing for food aid to come in. And I think in the coming days, we might see some sort of disaggregation in aid so that humanitarian aid can come in, but there might be more conditionality over other sorts of aid which have come into the country before. And of course, one of the biggest bits of support and funding that's come into Afghanistan over the last 20 years has been in military aid, and they're not going to get that from America. So you're seeing a very different sort of economy that's going to emerge. But if the donor countries can find a way of feeding the people, not letting the people starve, while still having some sort of leverage over the Taliban, that's the only leverage they've got. And there's not much leverage because America's departure was so quick and frankly handled so badly that they're in a very weak position here.
Talking about the US, there are still people inside Afghanistan, Americans included, who want to leave. And the idea was that they agreed with the Taliban that they will allow safe passage for those people who have travel documents. Is there still enough influence that the Americans have with the Taliban to allow or to give some security about people being allowed to leave still?
Well, frankly, no. And I think it's a really big challenge. And of course, the Taliban are most likely to ask the Americans for a list. Do the Americans give them a list of people, knowing that could actually allow them to go and round them up and use them as hostages? This is a really, really difficult situation for the United States in particular, but for some other Western countries. It's believed that there are some 200 or so US citizens, American citizens, still in Afghanistan. Some of them don't want to leave. Some of them are married to Afghans. They want to remain, but they're still potential targets in the years to come. And of course, there are hundreds, thousands of other people who are still vulnerable because of their relationship with the former government. Like everyone who's worked in Afghanistan, I have messages every day from people I've worked with over the years saying, look, can you write us a letter? Can you get us out? Can we get onto this scheme or that scheme to the UK or Canada? Because people who worked with the West are in fear of their lives.
This is a story that you've been covering for decades now. And I just wonder, from the 90s, back in the day when the Taliban were last a powerful force in the country, and now, do you have any idea of the kind of governance we're going to see going forward with the Taliban 2.0?
I think Taliban 2.0 is going to be pretty similar to 1.0. It's the only way they have of governing. They're not a sophisticated group of people. What happened in the last couple of weeks was just what happened in the 1990s. I was there with the Taliban when they took Kabul in 1996, and they went round the ministries and said, where's the money? And they did the same thing now. Of course, ministries in the modern world don't have boxes of money like a guerrilla army does. So I think it's going to be very difficult for them to turn from being an insurgency into being a government. And they don't have any of the techniques that they need in order to run a relatively sophisticated country, as Afghanistan is, at least in the cities. You've got some, perhaps 8-10 million people now living in cities in Afghanistan who want a very different kind of life, and those are the people who are protesting on the streets. I think it might be easier in the countryside, but even in the countryside, women are different now. Women demand and expect potential for education, the potential to be able to choose their own partners, to be able to work in whatever jobs they want. And that's been seen in a number of civil society programs in recent months, even in some quite remote areas in Afghanistan. So it's a very different country. I mean, when they took over in the mid-1990s, there was a sense of relief that they'd arrived, believe it or not. And I saw that in Kabul from my own eyes. There'd been a terrible civil war that had destroyed the city. The city was in ruins. There was unexploded bombs everywhere. It's not like that now. It's been completely rebuilt, and a new population, very young population, have emerged since the Taliban were last in power. And I don't think that the system that they have, the only system they have, which is very boring, rather traditionalist and very narrow view of Islam. It's not a view of Islam that many countries in the world, Islamic countries in the world, recognize. I don't think it's going to go down very well in Afghanistan, and I think it's going to be very difficult for them to make it work, really, and make it stick without significant repression. And of course, if they do that, then they're back to the international community isolating them, and potentially then I suppose they're back into things ending up supporting people like Al-Qaeda, and then you could see the whole cycle beginning again. Although in the very short term, it's hard to imagine that there's going to be any Western appetite for military intervention.
You talk about a narrow view of Islam, and that's the way they're going to be. So in many ways, there's a whole spiritual nature to what their struggle is about. Might we see a spiritual leader in Afghanistan, much in the same way as Iran, maybe?
Well, I think Mullah Omar played that role in the past, the leader who died in 2013. And he was very much seen as a figure who was both a military leader, a political leader, and a spiritual leader, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful, the defender of the faith in quite a profound way. And no one has quite been able to take that mantle since Mullah Omar's death. Haibatullah is a very different kind of character. He's a very extreme character. We talked about Mullah Hasan Akhund, who's the effective prime minister, but above him, you've got this character Haibatullah, who is a sort of much more of a clerical figure, and he does fill that role in a way, like the Ayatollahs in Iran, although, of course, that's a Shia society, so a rather different structure. But he does fulfill that role as a sort of spiritual leader. And we don't know much about Haibatullah. He was a teacher previously. He's very ideologically hardline, to the point that, and he's a very extreme in terms of terrorist activities, to the point that he encouraged his son to be a suicide bomber, and praised his memory when he'd been successful. So, this is a pretty tough individual in terms of his relationship with that society as we in the civilized world would like to see it. But I don't think he'll play a very public role. I think we'll see Haibatullah in the same way that you might see the Ayatollah in Iran. We have now this leadership of Mullah Hasan Akhund and Mullah Baradar as the key figures. But underneath them, the son of the founder, Yaqub, as a deputy, and Sirajuddin Haqqani, very significant player, very, very close to Pakistan, all extremists in any view of the world, and Haqqani, at least in particular, still connected to Al-Qaeda and backed by Pakistan. So it feels like a very dangerous moment for Afghanistan and the region that has happened after this long war that America's been fighting there.
You mentioned Al-Qaeda, and that was my next question. 20 years ago, it was about Al-Qaeda fighting terrorism. 20 years on, is Al-Qaeda still a factor? And therefore, is what the Americans feared 20 years ago, terror, global terror, still a fear?
You have to pinch yourself, don't you? It's remarkable. If you just think, what you were doing, everybody in the world can remember what they were doing on 9/11 in 2001. And, Al-Qaeda, a lot of people hadn't even heard of Al-Qaeda then. And of course, then the war began and it all, began to unravel. But they're still there. They're significantly weaker than they were. America has carried out a huge number of attacks on individuals. We know that Osama bin Laden, of course, was killed in Pakistan just 10 years ago in 2011. And they're still potentially significant players, still with their sort of global jihadi agenda. And interestingly, of course, the Taliban didn't have that much of a global jihadi agenda in 2001. Al-Qaeda were an aberration, really, for them. But now they do. Increasingly, the Taliban younger fighters, have modeled themselves on Syria, modeled themselves on some other parts of the world. And in a sense, a far more important threat to the international community is not just Al-Qaeda, but Islamic State. So Islamic State, Khorasan province, as it's called, ISK, who are play to quite an interesting and unusual myth in Islamic prophecy that the end times would come and the Mahdi would return, the Messiah, in the land of the two black flags, in the land called Khorasan. And Khorasan is an ancient name for a region of Western Afghanistan and now eastern Iran, the northern area of Afghanistan. And that Islamic State have chosen this name, Islamic State Khorasan, and that they have black flags is very deliberate. They're deliberately playing to this medieval iconography in order to try and recruit young jihadi warriors to say, you could be here for the end times. This is the most important moment in the history of the world. And that's quite powerful medicine for young jihadis who want to fight, who want to become martyrs. So they're competing for space with the Taliban in a sense at the moment. They're not allied with the Taliban. The Taliban are opposed to them. But they're very much competing for the same kinds of individuals. And the Taliban's only response to that will be to become more hardline in order not to lose the sense that they too are millennial jihadis who have this kind of interest at heart, because otherwise they'll lose their young recruits to Islamic State.
You were in Kabul not so long ago, just over a year ago, and I think Ashraf Ghani was getting inaugurated as president. At that stage, did you have any idea of what was already unfolding, it seems?
No. I mean, clearly the Taliban were getting stronger. Clearly they were then strong in the countryside. But America was still carrying out a very significant number of airstrikes and drone strikes and keeping them pretty contained. I mean, of course, a lot of civilians died in those drone strikes as well. I'm not painting that military operation as being sort of risk-free for civilians in any sense. And of course, it was very contentious for those reasons. But America was still there, and America might have remained. And President Biden had the choice of keeping troops in Afghanistan. When he came into office in January of this year, President Trump had tried to reduce them to really right down to nearly nil. There's only 2,500 right at the end, which is not much more than is useful for security and base support and just providing support for some of these drones. So it wasn't a very significant force. And there was a lot of pressure on President Biden from the military to say, well, look, we could stay forever. We could keep this contained. This is a footprint in a difficult region. The government's not perfect, but it's not bad. But Biden had been scarred, really, by the arguments carried out in the Obama administration. And I write about this a lot in my book, which you mentioned, The Long War, which is just coming out. In 2009, when President Obama took the decision to, he spent the whole of the first year of his administration deciding whether to pull troops out or increase troops in Afghanistan. And in the end, he did increase troops to the surge, as it was called, up to 100,000 American troops of 150,000 total. So quite a big international force by 2010, 2011. But Joe Biden was the strongest voice in the room always to reduce troops. And he felt that the generals were boxing them in. He felt that they were arguing for more troops then. And when he came into office this year and heard the army saying, well, we could be there forever, this is an insurance policy for the United States, he said, no, we're going to pull out. This is it. I'm going to be the president, the fourth president to take over this war. I'm going to be the president that closes it down. And I think we didn't expect, and I didn't expect, the catastrophic collapse that happened. But once the Taliban had decided that they were going to move on the cities, breaking the agreements that they'd made in Doha last year, then it became inevitable, I suppose, in the end. And the Afghan army, the morale in the Afghan army collapsed, and the army was hollowed out by corruption. And the good officers that were there and the good soldiers that were there were too few and too thinly spread to hold things together. And the collapse was very, very quick. And of course, the final end was precipitated by the departure of President Ghani, who left the palace without telling anybody except two of his closest advisors who he took with him.
All right, so as we look forward now, we know the fears internally for women, human rights issues, but externally, there was always this desire to keep Afghanistan reasonably stable because it was important to the region. What now, with no foreign forces inside the country and the Taliban pretty much left to their own devices? What does it mean for the region?
I think other regional countries will step in. It really matters to Iran that Afghanistan is stable and not a threat and not a source of refugees. It really matters to the Central Asian republics to the north, whose border security is pretty well in the hands of Russia. So Russia are the key player to the north. And it really matters to China for two reasons. Firstly, because they want to extract the significant mineral wealth of Afghanistan, the world's largest unexploited copper mine in Logar province just south of Kabul. And secondly, for China, that they want to stop terrorism coming across the border. China's carried out this very repressive action against the Uyghur minority in the Xinjiang province, which borders Afghanistan. So, and there are hundreds of Uyghur separatists, an organization called the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, who are based in Afghanistan, based in those northeastern mountains. And I think if China can get the Taliban to crack down on those militants, then they'll be far keener to support the Taliban government. So all of those regional countries have significant interest in a more stable Afghanistan, and I think we'll be stepping in where America has walked away and try and establish their own relations with the Taliban. And that leaves, of course, if you go west, north, and northeast, it leaves the south and the east, which are both borders to Pakistan. And I've mentioned them before in this interview, very significant backers of the Taliban, but they now have this real dilemma. It's a bit like a dog chasing a car. For 20 years, Pakistan has been chasing this car, and finally they caught it, and they just don't know what to do with it. So Pakistan has a challenge because they have this tough Islamist government to the west, which is not Indian-backed, which really suits Pakistan, their main reason for getting involved. But of course, it potentially threatens the stability of Pakistan because they have their own Islamist problem themselves. So having supported the Taliban, it could come back to bite them.